Yeah, Live Aid stirs up memories, of course, for me with Quo, because it was a unique moment in time, Live Aid.
Years later, long after the screaming crowds faded and the tapes were replayed a million times, Brian May admitted something that changed how people looked at Live Aid forever. He said the performance was perfect. He said it was historic. But then he added something stranger. He said there were forces at work that day you couldn't see on a set list. Not lights, not sound, not cameras, something else.
All we hear is radio gaga, radio boo.
On July 13th, 1985, the world wasn't just watching a concert. Nearly 2 billion people were watching the same moment at the same time. 2 continents, 2 stadiums, 1 heartbeat, and right in the center of it all stood Freddie Mercury, commanding a crowd like no human being ever had before. But Brian would later say something felt different that evening. He felt it in the air before he even stepped on stage. A tension, a weight, a pressure that had nothing to do with nerves. Queen wasn't the biggest band on the bill that day. They weren't the trendiest. Some critics even said their time had passed. Yet when those first piano notes rang out at Wembley Stadium, everything shifted. Brian now says it felt like something unseen had leaned in and whispered, "This moment matters." And that was only the beginning. What most fans still don't realize is this: Queen almost didn't take Live Aid seriously. By 1985, the band's relationship with radio in the US had cooled. Trends were changing. New synth acts were everywhere. Punk had shaken the industry. Queen was still massive, but they weren't dominating headlines the way they once had. And inside the band, motivation was complicated. When the invitation came from Bob Geldof, the urgency of it didn't hit everyone equally. To some artists, Live Aid felt like just another all-star show. To others, it felt risky. This was global television. No safety net, no second take. Brian later revealed he was the one who pushed hardest. He understood what this moment could be, not just for charity, but for Queen's survival in the modern era. Freddie surprisingly hesitated, not because he didn't care, but because he did. He knew that if Queen walked onto that stage and failed, the world would watch it happen in real time. And yet, once Freddie finally said yes, something changed instantly. The band stopped thinking like chart competitors. They started thinking like warriors preparing for one final charge. And that's when the hidden strategy began. While other acts treated Live Aid like a jam session, Queen treated it like a surgical operation. They were given barely 21 minutes. No encores, no extended solos, no room for error. And then came Bob Geldof's now famous instruction to the band: "Don't get clever, play the hits." That single sentence changed everything. Queen stripped their identity down to pure impact. Every song had one purpose: force the audience to participate. They didn't choose songs for musicians. They chose songs for human reflexes. Clap, sing, stomp, respond. The set was built like a ritual. A mysterious opening, a massive chant, a pounding rhythm, a triumphant finale. Brian later admitted they rehearsed this medley relentlessly while other artists barely soundchecked. Every second was timed, every landing measured, even the pauses were calculated. This wasn't luck, it was engineering emotion. And still, Brian insists none of that explains what happened when Freddie opened his mouth and Wembley answered back. Because preparation alone can't explain why the entire world seemed to lock into the same frequency at the same time. And the moment that proved that synchronization was coming next, Chapter 4. The sound that shouldn't have worked. Live Aid was chaos behind the scenes. Dozens of bands, endless equipment swaps, rushed sound checks, prioked technical mistakes everywhere. And yet, when Queen walked onto the stage at Live Aid, their sound came out cleaner than anyone else's that day. This was no accident. Before the show, Brian May personally argued with the sound engineers about speaker placement and monitor balance. He later admitted he was unusually stubborn, more than normal. Something in him refused to leave the sound a chance. At the same time, Freddie Mercury surprised the crew by insisting he didn't want heavy vocal effects. No echo, no safety polish, just raw voice. That decision terrified the technicians. Wembley Stadium was enormous. Open air, sound bounced unpredictably. Most singers relied on reverb to mask imperfections. Freddie wanted none of it. And when Queen started with that sharp, unguarded piano strike, the sound didn't scatter, it locked. Brian would later say it felt like the air itself carried the notes forward. Clear, powerful. untouched by the usual stadium distortion, almost as if the space had aligned itself. Some crew members later whispered that it was the cleanest live mix they had ever heard at Wembley, with no logical explanation, and that flawless transmission of sound set the stage for something even stranger. The first real shock didn't come from the music. It came from the silence. Freddie stepped forward. The crowd was loud, over 70,000 people packed into Wembley Stadium. Yet in that instant, something quieted. Not suddenly, gradually, like an invisible hand lowering the volume on human noise. Then Freddie did something no one had rehearsed. He tested the crowd, not with lyrics, with a sound. It was supposed to be a throwaway moment, a joke, a warm-up. Even Freddie didn't know if it would work, but when he stopped, Wembley answered back in perfect time. Not late, not early, exact. Freddie smiled, and did it again, and again. Each time the response came back stronger, more unified, until tens of thousands of people were moving as one organism. Brian would later admit this was the moment he realized something impossible was happening. No cue lights, no countdown, no wave effect, just instant mass synchronization. Band members across the industry, watching from backstage, stared in shock. Many later said the same thing. They'd never seen a crowd obey a human voice that way. And once the audience belonged to Freddie, nothing could stop what came next. As Queen tore through the middle of their set, Radio Gaga, Hammer to Fall, the opening surge of We Will Rock You, the energy rose to a level that seasoned road crews quietly called dangerous, not violent, overloaded. Brian felt it from his side of the stage. The vibration in the floor, the pressure in the air. The sensation wasn't excitement anymore. It was something closer to a storm building directly above them. And then something strange happened. Brian missed a note, just one. A tiny slip, barely audible to the crowd, but he felt it sharply. Yet instead of breaking the moment, the energy spiked higher. Freddie reacted instantly, adjusted his vocal phrasing to cover the shift. The band relocked in perfect timing within seconds. Brian would later describe that moment as the point where he stopped feeling like they were producing the performance and started feeling like they were being carried by it. Backstage, some technicians later claimed lights flickered in parts of the rig that shouldn't have been affected by the power draw at that moment. No official fault was ever reported, but multiple witnesses remembered it. The stage surged, the crowd surged, and Queen kept rising straight through the surge, untouched, as if swallowed by momentum too powerful to fail. And the emotion that was about to break Freddie wide open was still ahead. By the time the opening stomp of We Will Rock You hit the stage, something had already shifted. The crowd wasn't reacting anymore. They were responding on instinct. Every clap landed in perfect unison. Every stomp shook the metal beneath the stage like controlled thunder. From his position at stage left, Brian May looked out at the sea of faces and felt a strange sense of vertigo. He later described it as the feeling of standing inside a living organism, one breath, one pulse, one will. And at the center of it all was Freddie Mercury. Not performing, commanding. Freddie didn't pace nervously, didn't reach for validation. He stood still, eyes locked on the mass of humanity before him, and raised his fist. The response was instantaneous. 70,000 people moved as one. Some who were there later swore they stopped feeling like individuals. They said the noise didn't sound like applause, it sounded like a force rolling forward, lifting everything in its path. Freddie didn't smile. He looked almost stunned, as if even he hadn't expected to tap into something that powerful. For a brief second, he wasn't a rock star. He was a conduit, and no one on that stage fully understood what had just been unleashed. But the strangest moment of the set was still waiting for them. As the piano intro of We Are the Champions began to roll across Wembley Stadium, the emotional weight in the arena turned heavy, thick enough to slow your breath. This wasn't supposed to be triumphant. This was supposed to be the release. But something unusual happened. Before Freddie delivered the final chorus, the crowd surged early. They sang ahead of him, too loud, too fast, as if trying to pull the ending out of time itself. Brian felt the tempo slip, just slightly. Freddie noticed it too. For a split second, the entire performance faced collapse. Then Freddie did something no one expected. He stopped. Not fully, just enough to let the crowd pass him by. And when he re-entered, it was as if the song reset itself. Stronger, clearer, perfectly realigned. Brian later described that moment as time folding back into place. No technical explanation ever made sense. The metronomes didn't match it. The recordings showed the adjustment, but not the reason for it. Some backstage insisted the audience had unconsciously corrected the band. Others whispered something stranger, that the energy itself had refused to let the moment break. And when Freddie struck the last note, fists raised, sweat-drenched, victorious, no one doubted it. They hadn't just witnessed a great performance. They had survived something intense, something charged, something rare. For decades, Brian avoided speaking about the unexplainable part of that day. He talked about preparation, about discipline, about chemistry, about hard work, but never about the feeling until much later. In private conversations, Brian finally admitted something that startled even those closest to him. During Queen's Live Aid set, there was a stretch of time where he no longer felt in control of the music. The notes were flowing, his hands were moving, but the sensation of deciding had vanished. He described it as being picked up by momentum that didn't belong to us anymore. Not nerves, not adrenaline, something else. Brian never used words like supernatural, but he did say this: whatever happened that day, it wasn't just us. He also confessed that for years afterward, he tried to recreate that feeling on stage. Same songs, same guitar, same crowds. It never returned, not once. That realization unsettled him more than any technical mistake ever could. Because it meant Live Aid wasn't just legendary because of performance, it was legendary because of alignment, timing, energy, and a convergence of forces that Queen themselves never fully controlled. And the final truth behind that convergence is even harder to explain. When Queen walked off the stage that night, there was no celebration backstage, no shouting, no champagne, no victory laps, just silence. The same kind of silence that follows a natural disaster or a religious experience. They all felt it. Something had passed through them. Brian sat with his guitar still in his hands, fingers aching, heart racing, unable to speak. Road crew members later said his face looked pale, almost shaken. Freddie, normally bursting with post-show energy, grew strangely quiet for several minutes. Not exhausted, reflective, as if he too had realized something rare had just ended. Years later, Brian finally understood what bothered him most about Live Aid. It wasn't that it was their best performance. It's that it could never happen again. Not because the band changed, not because the world changed, but because whatever aligned that day, timing, hunger, fear, charity, redemption, pressure, audience, sound, history, would never align in that way again. You can rehearse songs, you can tune guitars, you can engineer lighting, but you cannot rehearse convergence. Brian now believes that Live Aid wasn't just a performance, it was a collision of purpose with desperation, of decline with rebirth, of global suffering with global sound. And for 21 minutes, those forces met in one place, once and never again.